I have personal goals as well, outside of my internet goals and my career goals. And this is actually something very interesting I want to tie back into our earlier conversation when we were talking about monogamy and polyamory and all these other things. Because it's my goal to have as many children as possible.
Is it so you could have your offsprings deliver your message, or because you just want kids? You want like mini disciples running around and being like,
if you have
stop having fun.
If you have an empire, you need heirs, right?
Yep.
If you have a large empire, you need a lot of heirs, right? Mm-hmm. So I want at least 25 children.
Okay, so we see what Andrew Tate believes as it relates to leaving a legacy, an inheritance, having 25 children. So let's go ahead and see what else he has to say in this video, and then we'll comment on the back end.
I have personal goals as well, outside of my internet goals and my career goals. And this is actually something very interesting I want to tie back into our earlier conversation when we were talking about monogamy and polyamory and all these other things. Because it's my goal to have as many children as possible.
Is it so you could have your offsprings deliver your message, or because you just want kids? You want like mini disciples running around and being like,
if you have
stop having fun.
If you have an empire, you need heirs, right?
Yep.
If you have a large empire, you need a lot of heirs, right? Mm-hmm. So I want at least 25 children. So what do you think?
Oh, you're trying to be Nick Cannon out here.
Yeah. So what do you think from a religious perspective about someone who is destined on having as many children as possible, but obviously to do that, he would need more than one woman? Do you still think that's a sin?
Ooh. Well, I think putting your needs above God's is a sin. So you need 25 kids.
It's interesting. Is it my needs? Is it selfishness?
Well, you just said, you were like, well, God, is it? You knew that it would be against God because God just wants you to have one woman.
Perfect. To be honest with you, I've never read the Bible cover to cover, so I don't know if it is.
Spoiler alert, one man, one woman.
Yeah. Sounds like a boring book.
But you know why he does that? It's
to preserve society.
No, it's just to demonstrate your relationship with him. Because once you stop, you love, okay, think about this, right?
Yep.
You love a woman.
Yep.
And you provide a family.
Yep.
A covenant.
Yep.
A kingdom. But then you get to the point where you're like, I need more. This is what Adam did with God. I need more.
Don't you feel like, let me ask the question from another way. Don't you think the good people and the intelligent people of Earth need to be having kids at least at the same rate as the idiots? I mean, we have a population. No,
it's a great question. It's a great question.
And we can also look at this. We can take it away from the religious argument and look at it another way. We have a serious population crisis in the West. If you want to, I don't know if you know about this, but there's a huge demographic collapse incoming. And the reason we have these massive numbers of immigration and the reason our cultures are collapsing is because we no longer reproduce at the basic rate of sustaining a population. So 2 people are supposed to have 3.7 kids on average for the population to increase. But how many people do you know with 4 children?
Very rare.
None. So 2 people have 1 kid, population goes down. 2 people have 2 kids, population still goes down because people die. People die in car crashes, these kinds of things. So we have huge problems from a socioeconomic point of view because you now have people living longer because of medicine. They have longer pensions, longer retirements. They need to be paid for. You're supposed to have a huge tax base of young people working. We don't have anyone having enough children to sustain the tax base. So what the people in charge of the world are doing is saying, okay, well then we need to import third worlders to sustain this entire pyramid scheme we have, this Ponzi scheme of you working your ass off so you can retire later. We need to import third worlders who are going to work for pennies and they'll pay taxes so we can sustain it. But that's why all the cultures are collapsing. So you look at this, very interesting. A Christian country is now being invaded by Muslims and third worlders, and you're losing your Christian identity because you don't have enough children to sustain the population.
Yeah.
Because you're only allowed 1 woman.
Got it.
So this is a interesting point. Whereas a Muslim man can have 4 wives and 16 kids
and just pump them out,
and they can survive and protect their identity and their culture and their religion. So it's actually very interesting. And before I let you answer, only one country solved this: Hungary. Hungary is a Christian nation, and Viktor Orban is one of the smartest world leaders on the planet. He abolished income tax for any family that has more than 4 children. And he's fixed the population crisis, and the population is increasing because people are getting married and having kids. Hungary's fixed it. No other nation has fixed it because you can't even afford to have 4 or 5 children because they're decimating you and destroying the currency, and they're just doing all this matrix propaganda on purpose anyway. So, besides Hungary, every other Western nation is now importing the Islamic world to sustain itself because Christian nations can't reproduce. So it's interesting what you said. I agree with what you said, but it's also the death throes of Christianity. Christianity is about to be decimated because of that. Because what do you have without people?
You want my answer?
Yeah.
Okay. First, would you like more coffee?
Yeah, I'll have 2 more coffees, please.
Can we get 2 more coffees?
Thank you.
You want some more coffee? Sure. Reed?
Sure.
Please, give my men coffee. Okay, my answer is this. Never in the day of age did we ever have the power to talk to a mass group of people since the internet.
Yep.
So ironically, we're running into this problem of less of our people,
Yep.
but we also have the gift of reaching out to more people.
Correct.
So another household could have 5 kids, but who's to say that I can't encourage them to have my morals and standpoints?
Absolutely. You could
So
have.
I don't need to procreate. I need to provide and educate.
That's a very interesting point of view. But then you also, this brings us into the Islam versus Christianity argument. And I want to make it very clear to the world that I am not anti-Christian in any way. Most of my family is Christian. My brother is Christian. For a long time when I first...
Tristan's Christian?
Yeah, he's Christian.
Cool. He's happy and he has fun.
Yeah, that's right. Perhaps that's why. When I first stopped being atheistic, I reverted or diverted to Christianity because it was all I knew. Because I was raised Christian. I went to church as a kid. It's all I knew. But you're talking about the fact that, yeah, people can come into the nation, but if they become Christians once they arrive, then the Christian faith survives.
Yeah.
But I think that for that to happen, there would have to be some form of power gap or power vacuum, and it's not atheists which are arriving, and it's going to be very difficult to convince them out of Islam into Christianity, and I'll tell you why. I am not an Islamic scholar, and I don't consider myself knowledgeable on Islam. I'm new to the religion. I'm only a year in, and I'm studying as best I can, but there's a lot of people who know more than me. But from my understanding and my practices, Islam is very rigid.
All right, now Tate goes on to talk about the rigidity of Islam and why the rigidity of Islam made it personally attractive to him. But I'm here to touch upon the question that Tate asked George as it relates to procreation. And understand that this was a question being asked from an Islamic person to a Christian. So we're going to give a Christian response to this answer and hopefully clear up some things that might have been misconstrued in the past. All right, so to reiterate the question one more time, it was, what do you believe about having more than one wife as it relates to procreation? Can you give a religious perspective on that? And again, this is an Islamic person asking a Christian, so let's give a Christian response. Now, I believe that George gave a pretty good answer, but I'd like to take it a little bit deeper here in this video. Now, before I do that, I would like to explain something that we see in the Bible called description versus prescription. Many times whenever we read the Bible, we see an example or a story, something being described. For example, King Solomon, he had many wives and many concubines. But just because you see that as a description in the Bible, that doesn't mean that God prescribed it. And what we mean by that is, here's an example in relation to this very specific question. In Deuteronomy 17:17, God specifically says to the kings of Israel that they are not to multiply their wives. So that's a prescription. It's a command of the Lord. Now, to answer a quick rebuttal to that is, someone could say, this is a command specifically to the kings of Israel. How does this apply to the people? Or how does this apply to Christianity even today? Now, we got to understand that Christianity is the full fulfillment of Judaism, but we can still learn more from the Old Testament as it relates to something that has been consistent from Old Testament to New Testament. Now, the king's job was to uphold the standard for the people. The people were to look to the king and see, this is the standard that I have to follow. And what we're going to do is we're going to get deeper into context to understand that this multiply, or this idea of multiplicity, is that there's a plurality and a singularity to it. So let's get into this a little bit more. So what I'd like to do is read one verse prior to verse 17. And what we're going to see is this idea of don't multiply to this and don't multiply to that. So let me go ahead and read verse 16. It says, speaking of God to the king, it says, but he shall not multiply horses to himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt, to the end that he should multiply horses. For as much as the Lord hath said unto you, ye shall henceforth return no more that way. Now, what does this mean to multiply in these different contexts the Lord is commanding the kings of Israel not to multiply in? And we'll find contextual evidence within Scripture that makes it clear the answer to Tate's question is one man and one woman becoming one flesh. The Hebrew word for multiply is rabbah, and it's pronounced this way. Now, this word is a verb, and it means to multiply, to become numerous, become great. And this entails multiplicity, to increase, to have much or many in abundance. So let's put this into context. This Hebrew word, rabbah, Let's put it into context. For each category, the Lord has commanded the kings not to multiply in, as it relates to the two verses we have read. So again, it says that he shall not multiply his horses. We know the king and his people have more than one horse in their land. So direct context makes it clear this is an original plurality or multiplicity, as the king wouldn't only have one horse to begin with, but many, a multiplicity. So originally he has multiple horses and was told not to add to them. If the king of Israel were to multiply in horses, this meant the people of Israel would again be tying themselves back to the territory of Egypt, to obtain more horses from the land God originally freed them from. So it would be a perverse thing to go against the command of God to multiply horses, as they risk the chance of backsliding. So now to verse 17, it says the king ought not multiply his silver and gold. And again, this is an original plurality of multiplicity. And what I mean by that is the king wouldn't have just 1 or 2 bars of silver or gold. He would have multiple. Now, to add unnecessary wealth to the king's already multiplicity of wealth would be a perverse thing to do in the eyes of the Lord. Now that this word rabbah for multiply, it's put into context for these other groups as it relates to multiplying. We see originally I said it has to do with a plurality and a singularity. The plurality as it relates to the gold, the silver, and the horses has already been addressed and put into context. But now we're going to deal with what it means to multiply wives, because some people interpret this to mean, or they ask the question, does this mean they already had 2 or 3 and they shouldn't multiply to those? And this is where the context of the singularity comes into play as it relates to the scripture. So let's break it down. Notice it does not say that the king shall not multiply to his wives, which would imply he had wives plural, that being more than one wife before the command came. It says he shall not multiply wives. This is not stating the king already has wives plural. Rather, it's stating the king ought not have a plurality of wives, meaning keep this a singular union, as Genesis 2 verses 23 through 24 originally commands. The man said, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. He shall be called woman, for she was taken out of me. That is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh." So biblical context would explain that if the king were to add wives to himself, this would be turning wife singular into wives plural, which is against God's command. Now, what I want to do is bring a couple more examples from the New Testament. Jesus says in Matthew 19 verses 4 through 6, as he was asked a question about divorce, Jesus says, "Haven't you read," he replied, "that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female, and said for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore what God has joined together, let no one separate." Now, even the Apostle Paul refers back to this in Ephesians 5:3, where he says, "As the scriptures say, a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two are united into one." Now, what Jesus is doing is he's grounding this in the original plan that God had for mankind. Now he goes to Adam and Eve. He's talking about God made them as one flesh, a singular union. They become one. Now, it's also important to understand that something called fornication is having sexual relations outside of marriage, outside of this original covenant that Christ is referring back to. That is something that is not going to be used or deemed as holy unto the Lord to bring about procreation. Now, I want to look at something very important as it relates to what I originally stated, which was the idea of description versus prescription. And what we're going to see is it looks like a man has more than one wife, and he is commanded what to do as it relates to these different relationships that he has. And what we see is that God is trying to bring out the best out of this person, or whoever has more than one wife. He's trying to bring out the best out of their disobedience. This can be found in Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 15 through 16, where God states, "If a man has 2 wives, and he loves one but not the other, and both bear him sons, but the firstborn is the son of the wife he does not love, when he wills his property to his sons, he must not give the rights of the firstborn to the son of the wife he loves in preference to his actual firstborn." Even though it says 2 wives, this is not in confliction with Deuteronomy 17, with Matthew 19, with Ephesians 5. This is God foreseeing the people's disobedience and encouraging the people to bring out the best from their disobedience. And let me give an example of why this is the case. Exodus 20, verses 4 through 5, God says, "You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above or on earth below." Now pay attention to this. This is the very next verse. "You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, your God, am jealous." So one verse, God is telling the people not to make idols. In the very next verse, God is telling them not to worship those idols. This shows God knew they were going to disobey, or else he would have just stopped at "don't make idols," and he wouldn't have had to say, "Okay, don't worship them." So now God basically has to say, "Okay, don't worship the thing I just told you not to make." So God is saying, when you disobey by making the idol, don't take your disobedience further in this way by worshiping them. So this principle applies to Deuteronomy 21 as well, where the man has more than one wife. We already are commanded not to have more than one wife. So what God is doing is stepping into their disobedience and encouraging them not to take it further by not giving the firstborn what rightfully belongs to him. Now, this is something where there is both description and prescription within this same command. God is stepping within the description of their disobedience and prescribing them not to take it further. Now, in closing, I want to talk about one of the first things that came to my mind upon hearing Andrew Tate speak. The first thing that I thought about as an inheritance or leaving a legacy was the promise of Abraham. He was promised by God that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars, but there was this amount of time that went by where God originally promised him this thing and it didn't come to pass yet. So what Abraham does is he sleeps with his wife's handmaid to bring about this inheritance or this child that can bring or that he can give his inheritance to. He's trying to manufacture God's promise. And what happens is, long story short, he has to kick away the child and God ends up blessing the mother and the child that he had a baby with. But what happens is when you do things outside of God's will, it's going to bring unnecessary pain and unnecessary hurt. So if God is commanding us the way to have this marital status, and if God said be fruitful and multiply, then it makes sense that we should stay within the standard and within the commands that the Lord told us to do so. Because with Abraham trying to manufacture this in the flesh, that being the promise of God, he hurt his wife in the process, he hurt the woman that he slept with, and he hurt his child that came through this son of the flesh, that being the son outside of the promise of God. When reading the Bible, it's important to understand the idea of description versus prescription. And also it's important to understand and study the historicity of Jesus Christ and the authority that he had and claimed to have, that he was God and the Son of God. Now, he was more than a prophet. He was God incarnate, God in the flesh, and he died and he rose again. Now, the conversation that the Muslim and the Christian needs to have is a very important conversation. So hopefully I'll be talking about that a little bit more in the future. And with that being said, thanks for watching this video, and I hope you have a good day.